The morning Rosa Merriweather was supposed to try on her wedding dress. She stood at the edge of the Doyle property and wondered if a woman could simply walk into the horizon and disappear. The Texas sky in the spring of 1878 was the kind of blue that made you ache, wide and infinite in a way that mocked the smallness of the life being arranged around her. Red dust clung to the hem of her calico dress, and somewhere behind her, inside the white clapboard house that sat like a proud old tooth against the flat plain, she could hear her mother speaking in the quick, breathless way she always did when she was trying to seal a deal before someone changed their mind. The deal in this case was Rosa herself. Rosa was 22 years old, with dark chestnut hair that curled stubbornly at the ends no matter how tightly she pinned it, and brown eyes that her father had once called the color of good river mud, which she had never decided was a compliment or not. She was not what the ladies of Carver Creek called a conventional beauty, but she had a kind of steady, earnest quality to her face that made people trust her, and a laugh that came out of her before she could stop it, loud and unguarded, which the ladies of Carver Creek considered unbecoming in a woman of marriageable age. She was marrying Clifton Doyle. That was the arrangement. Had been the arrangement for the better part of 6 months, ever since her father, Thomas Merriweather, had borrowed a significant sum of money from Harold Doyle to keep their small cattle operation from going under after a fever swept through half the herd. Harold Doyle was the kind of man who called in favors in ways that did not always resemble favors, and when he had suggested that his eldest son Clifton might be in need of a good wife, Thomas Merriweather had looked at his only daughter with an expression that was equal parts guilt and relief. Rosa had not said no. She had not, if she was honest with herself, said much of anything. She had stood in her father's study, which smelled of pipe tobacco and old ledgers, and she had looked at her father's tired face and thought about how much he had aged in the past year, and she had said, quietly, that she supposed she could meet Clifton. Meeting Clifton had not been the problem. Clifton was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, and not unkind. He had a habit of talking over people and a laugh that never quite reached his eyes, but he was not a cruel man, and he had spoken to Rosa with the careful politeness of a man who understood he was receiving something valuable and did not want to break it. She could have lived with Clifton. She had told herself this many times in the months since the arrangement had been made, in the quiet of her bedroom when sleep refused to come. She could have lived with Clifton, but living with someone and choosing someone were two entirely different things, and it was this distinction that Rosa Merriweather turned over and over in her mind as she stood at the edge of the Doyle property on a warm April morning in 1878 and stared into the blue Texas sky. "You look like you're fixing to bolt." The voice came from behind her and to the left, and it was not Clifton's voice. Rosa turned. He was leaning against the fence post at the corner of the property, the younger Doyle boy, Aaron. She knew of him the way you know of a person in a small town without quite knowing them, in pieces and impressions. He was 24, 2 years younger than Clifton, with the same dark hair their father had in old photographs but a different quality to his face, something more open and unguarded, lines around his mouth that came from smiling rather than squinting. He worked the south pasture mostly, and when he came into town he came alone, and he had a reputation for being quiet and a little strange by the standards of Carver Creek, which meant he read books and occasionally disagreed with his father. He was watching her now with an expression she could not quite read. Not mockery. Not pity, something more careful than either of those things. "I was not fixing to bolt," Rosa said, because it was the dignified answer. "All right," he said, and he did not argue with her, which she found unexpectedly disarming. He pushed off from the fence post and came to stand beside her, not too close, looking out at the same stretch of flat land she had been staring at. He had his hat in his hands and he turned it by the brim in slow circles, a habit she would come to know well. "It's a good morning," he said after a pause. "Yes," she agreed. Another silence settled between them, but it was not an uncomfortable one. Somewhere in the middle distance, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire, and a warm wind moved through the dry grass, and Rosa found herself breathing more slowly than she had in weeks. "Can I ask you something?" Aaron said. She looked at him sideways. "You can ask." He was quiet for a moment longer, still turning the hat by its brim. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she had not noticed before, and he said, with a simplicity that she would remember for the rest of her life, "Are you happy about this?" The question landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through her were immediate and unmistakable. No one had asked her that. Not her father, who loved her but was afraid of her answer. Not her mother, who had already begun planning the tablecloths. Not Clifton, who she suspected believed happiness was something that came after the practical matters were settled, like dessert after a meal. Not a single person in Carver Creek had thought to pose to Rosa Merriweather the basic and revolutionary question of whether she wanted what was being arranged for her. She opened her mouth to say something polite and deflecting, and what came out instead was the truth. "No," she said, "I am not." Aaron Doyle looked at her for a long moment. He did not look surprised exactly. He looked like a man who had expected this answer and was not sure what to do with the fact that he had been right. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. "It doesn't matter," Rosa said, because this was the sensible thing, because this was the thing her mother would say, because this was the logic that had carried her this far. "My father needs the agreement to hold. The debt is real. Clifton is not a bad man." "No," Aaron agreed. "He is not, but not being bad is a low bar for a husband." Rosa felt something shift dangerously inside her. "Mr. Doyle, I don't see what business it is of yours." "It probably isn't," he said, easily, without offense. "I just have a habit of asking questions that aren't my business." She looked at him, this younger son leaning against a fence post on a Tuesday morning, turning his hat in his hands, who had just cracked open the carefully sealed room she had been locking herself inside for 6 months, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen. She turned back toward the house. "I should go inside. My mother is waiting." "Rosa," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she stopped walking. "For what it's worth, you deserve to be asked." She did not turn around. She kept walking. But she carried those words with her into the house, and into the fitting room where her mother was arranging white muslin. And she carried them through lunch and through the polite and somewhat strained conversation with Clifton that afternoon. And she carried them home to the Merriweather ranch as the sun went down orange and gold over the flat Texas plain. And she was still carrying them when she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark. You deserve to be asked. Rosa Merriweather had grown up understanding that women in Carver Creek, Texas, in 1878 did not have an abundance of choices. She was not naive about this. The frontier was not a gentle place, and the arrangements that governed the lives of women were practical before they were anything else. She had watched her own mother build a life from duty and had seen the quiet dignity of it, and she did not despise practical arrangements on principle. But she was 22 years old and she had never been asked, and apparently all it took was one gray-green-eyed man with a quietly restless soul to make that fact feel like something she could not simply swallow and move past. She saw Aaron Doyle again 3 days later. She had come to the Doyle ranch to go over table linens with Harold Doyle's wife, Margaret, who was a brisk and efficient woman with a talent for making you feel like every suggestion you made was slightly wrong, but not wrong enough to say so out loud. Rosa had survived 2 hours of this and was untying her horse from the post outside when she heard boot steps on the gravel and looked up. Aaron was crossing the yard with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a water canteen in his other hand. He was dusty from work, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he saw her and changed his direction without any particular ceremony, coming toward her the way a man comes toward something that has been in the back of his mind. "Rosa," he said. "Mr. Doyle," she said very properly. "You can call me Aaron, Unless you prefer Mr. Doyle, in which case I'll start calling you Miss Merriweather with full formality every single time, and I suspect we'll both find that exhausting." A laugh escaped her before she could catch it, that loud, unguarded laugh that the ladies of Carver Creek found unbecoming. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and Aaron Doyle smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that happened in the eyes first. "How are the table linens?" he asked. "Perfect," she said. "All of them, every single one. I have been informed of this 17 times. That sounds like Mother. She has very strong feelings about edging." "She has very strong feelings about everything," Aaron said, setting his coil of rope against the fence. "But table linens in particular." They stood in the afternoon light and talked, in the easy, slightly surprised way of two people discovering that they fit together in conversation without effort, the sentences passing back and forth, without the careful calculation that usually governed talk between unmarried men and women in Carver Creek. He told her about the South pasture, about a horse he had been trying to settle for 2 weeks that still had not made its peace with him. She told him about the Merriweather herd, about a particular stubborn steer that had escaped 3 times in 1 month and had begun to feel like a personal affront. "A steer with opinions," Aaron said. "Strong ones. He has views on fencing." "I respect that, actually." She looked at him. "You respect a steer. I respect anything with the conviction to keep going back through the same fence even after it gets returned 3 times. That's persistence. That's stubbornness. Sometimes those look the same from the outside," he said, and there was something in the way he looked at her when he said it that made her think he was not entirely talking about the steer. She rode home that afternoon with her heart going faster than the occasion warranted, and she sat at the dinner table across from her father and told herself firmly that she was being foolish. The arrangement was made. The debt was real. Clifton Doyle was not a bad man. She said all of this to herself in order, like a catechism, and it helped approximately as much as catechisms usually do when the thing you are trying to resist is already inside you. The weeks that followed had a strange doubled quality to them, as though Rosa were living 2 lives simultaneously. In the visible, orderly life, she attended to the preparations for her wedding to Clifton Doyle, which was set for the 23rd of June. She discussed the ceremony with Pastor Willard at the little white church in Carver Creek. She went with her mother to the seamstress in Abilene, 40 miles east, where a dress was being made in cream-colored silk that her mother had saved for, carefully and quietly, for years. She attended the small dinners that Margaret Doyle organized, where she sat across from Clifton and answered his careful, polite questions about her preferences and her opinions, and he listened with the concentrated effort of a man studying for an examination. And in the invisible, private life, she talked to Aaron Doyle whenever circumstance placed them in the same space, which, on a ranch that was attached by debt and arrangement to her own, was more often than was probably advisable. She learned things about him in fragments and pieces, the way you learn a landscape by traveling it slowly. She learned that he had been the kind of boy who asked too many questions and had gotten himself in regular trouble for it. Not malicious trouble, but the quiet kind that comes from an honest mind in a world that prefers comfortable answers. She learned that he had spent a year in San Antonio when he was 19, working for a surveying company, mapping the land with instruments and mathematics, and that this year had given him a particular way of looking at things, a habit of finding the precise shape of what was in front of him rather than assuming. She learned that he disagreed with his father about nearly everything significant, quietly and without drama, in the way of a man who has long since stopped expecting agreement and is at peace with the distance. She learned, one afternoon when they were both helping the hands move a section of fence on the north pasture, that he had not had an easy relationship with the expectation of who he was supposed to be. Harold Doyle was a man who believed in lineage and succession, who had shaped Clifton into the image of himself and had been somewhat baffled by the second son, who did not seem to want the things he was supposed to want. "What do you want?" Rosa asked, because she had begun by now to ask him the questions that felt too big to ask anyone else. He considered this with the same serious attention he gave everything. They were walking back along the fence line in the late afternoon, and the light was turning the dry grass gold, and somewhere behind them the hands were finishing the last post. "Land," he said finally. "My own land. Not the Doyle land which will go to Clifton, because that is how it has always been and will always be. A piece of ground that I chose and worked myself. Maybe something toward the hill country where there's water." He paused. "I know that sounds small." "It doesn't," Rosa said. "It sounds honest." He looked at her. "What about you? What do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. The honest answer was dangerous. The honest answer had been growing inside her like a slow fire for weeks, and she was not sure she trusted herself to speak it out loud without setting something irreversible in motion. "I want to choose," she said finally, carefully. "I think that is mostly what I want. To have chosen." He understood what she meant without her having to explain it further. This was one of the things about Aaron Doyle that undid her, the way he listened until he heard what was actually being said. "That's not a small want," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It is not." They walked back to the house in silence, and the silence was the kind that holds things, that is full rather than empty, and Rosa understood in a very certain and irreversible way that she was in serious trouble. It was her mother who named it first. Clara Merriweather was a practical woman who had been watching her daughter carefully for the better part of 2 months with the particular attention of a woman who knows what she is looking for. She said nothing for a very long time, in the way of a mother who is giving a situation room to resolve itself before intervening. And then one evening in late May, when Rosa came home from the Doyle ranch with her cheeks flushed from more than the sun, Clara sat down across from her at the kitchen table and folded her hands and said, without preamble, "It's the younger one, isn't it?" Rosa looked up from the bread she had been slicing. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You know exactly what I mean," her mother said. "And I need you to be honest with me, Rosa, because what you do next is going to have consequences for this family, and you need to do it with your eyes open." Rosa set down the bread knife. She looked at her mother's face, which was kind and tired and frightened in equal measure, and she said, "Yes." "It is." Clara Merriweather pressed her lips together. For a long moment she said nothing, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sounds of the prairie coming through the window, the wind and the insects and the distant lowing of cattle. "Does he know?" her mother asked. "I don't know," Rosa said. "I think perhaps we have not spoken of it." "Your father," Clara began and then stopped. She started again. "Your father's debt is to Harold Doyle, not to Clifton. The arrangement is with Clifton. If that arrangement falls apart, Harold Doyle will call in the debt immediately and we will lose the ranch. You understand that?" "Yes," Rosa said. "I understand that." "And you are still telling me it's the younger one." Rosa looked down at the table. Outside the window the sun was going down in colors that seemed indulgent given the weight of the conversation happening inside. "Yes," she said, "I am still telling you that." Her mother sat with this for a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Rosa's. "Then something has to change," she said, "and it had better change honestly." Rosa went to the Doyle ranch the following morning before the day had fully decided what it was going to be, when the sky was still pale and the air was cool, and the horses were moving in the paddock with the lazy interest of animals who know breakfast is coming. She had not slept much and she had not made a plan, and she had decided, somewhere around 2 in the morning, that she had spent long enough making plans, and that what she needed now was to simply say the true thing. Aaron was at the paddock fence, watching a young mare that had been giving him trouble, and he turned when he heard her horse, and his expression went through several things before settling on careful. "Rosa," he said. "I need to talk to you," she said. She dismounted and tied her horse and came to stand beside him at the fence, and for a moment she looked at the young mare moving in circles in the paddock and thought about how strange it was to be standing here, about to do the thing she was about to do. "I think you know why I came," she said. "I think I might," he said. His voice was very quiet. I am supposed to marry your brother, she said, because it was important to name the thing clearly, to not let it sit in euphemism. That arrangement was made for real reasons that are still real. My father's debt is not a small thing. The consequences of breaking it are not a small thing. I know, Aaron said. And I am standing here anyway, Rosa said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not, because you asked me whether I was happy, and in the asking of that question you opened something that I cannot close back up, and I think you should know that. Aaron Doyle turned from the fence and looked at her fully, the way he had of looking at things, finding their precise shape. Rosa, he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized because she had been hearing it in her own voice for weeks. I have been going about my days thinking about you in a way that is not appropriate for a man whose brother is engaged to you. I need you to know that I know that. I know that you know that, she said. And I also need you to know, he continued, that if things were different, if the arrangement did not exist, and the debt did not exist, and Clifton did not exist, I would have found some reason to be near you every day since the first time I saw you standing at this fence staring at the horizon like it had personally offended you. Something in Rosa's chest expanded dangerously. You said you thought I looked like I was fixing to bolt, she said. I said you looked like you were fixing to bolt, he agreed, because I recognized the look. I have worn it myself most of my life. They stood very close now, close enough that she could see the particular gray-green of his eyes in the morning light, and there was a moment that stretched between them like the flat Texas plain, full of sky and possibility and the very clear knowledge of everything that stood in the way. What do we do? She asked. I don't know, he said honestly. But I think the first thing that needs to happen is that Clifton needs to know the truth. And my father, and your father, he paused. In that order preferably so that by the time my father hears it, it is already a fact rather than a plan. Your father will not receive it well, Rosa said. No, Aaron agreed. He will not. He may call in the debt. He may, Aaron said. That's a real risk and I won't pretend otherwise. Rosa looked at him. Why are you willing to do this? You stand to lose things too, your place here, your relationship with your family. Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I told you I want my own land, my own ground that I chose and worked. I have been saving for 3 years. I have enough to buy a parcel south of here and enough left over to get a small herd started. He met her eyes. And I told you you deserve to be asked. I meant that. I don't know how to look at you and help arrange something that you never chose. Rosa Merriweather stood in the early morning at the Doyle ranch and made the decision that would change the shape of her life. She made it clearly and completely, with her eyes open, the way her mother had asked her to. All right, she said. Then we tell them. Clifton was the first. Rosa asked to speak to him privately, and to his credit, he arranged it without questions, in the small parlor off the main hall of the Doyle house, where there was a horsehair sofa and a window that looked out at the paddock. He sat across from her with his big hands resting on his knees, and she told him simply and directly. She told him that she had come to realize she could not marry him honestly. She told him that her feelings had developed in a direction she had not anticipated and had not chosen, and that she believed he deserved a wife who came to him freely and without reservation, and that she was not able to be that. She did not tell him, not yet, about Aaron. That part was harder and needed to come separately. Clifton listened to all of this without interrupting. His face went through things she watched carefully, surprise, and then something that looked uncomfortably like relief before he controlled it, and then a careful, settled neutrality. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're certain, he said. Yes, she said. I am very sorry, Clifton. He looked at the window. Is it because you don't like me or because you don't love me? The second, Rosa said honestly. You are not an easy man not to like, but liking is not enough. He nodded slowly. No, he said after a moment. I suppose it is not. And then to her great surprise, he said, I think I knew it wasn't the right fit. I think I told myself the arrangement would be enough. He looked back at her with his careful, honest face. I'm sorry for my part in not addressing that sooner. Rosa felt a sudden and profound gratitude for the particular decency of Clifton Doyle. This man she was not in love with but who, in this moment, was being better than the situation required. "Thank you," she said. "My father," Clifton began. "I know," she said. "We will speak to him." Clifton looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something click into place behind his eyes, something like a puzzle piece finding its correct position. "It's Aaron," he said. It was not quite a question. Rosa held his gaze. "Yes," she said. Clifton sat with this for a time that felt long and was probably only a minute. Then he let out a slow breath and looked out the window again. "Aaron," he said quietly, not with anger but with the tone of a man sorting through an unexpected set of facts. "He never did things the conventional way." "No," Rosa said. "He does not." "Does he know you're here, talking to me?" "Yes, it was his idea to tell you first." Clifton nodded. He stood up and went to the window and stood there looking out at the paddock where the young mare was still moving in circles. "I'm not going to stand in the way of it," he said finally. "For what it's worth. That is between you and Aaron, and God help you both, my father." He turned back to her. "But I'll tell you that whoever Aaron ends up with has to have a backbone made of good Texas iron, because my father is not going to take this quietly." "I know," Rosa said. "I have been told." "Do you have that?" he asked, and it was a genuine question without malice. "The backbone." Rosa Merriweather thought about standing at the edge of this very property and staring at the horizon, and about the 6 months she had spent swallowing herself, and about lying awake at night telling herself the same catechism over and over until she finally stopped believing it. "I am working on it," she said. "Yes." Harold Doyle was a large man with large opinions who had built something real in the dust of the Texas plains, and believed, with the uncomplicated confidence of a man who has been right about most of the practical things, that he was also right about the rest. He had built the ranch with his hands, had driven cattle to Abilene before the railroad made it clean and orderly, had survived drought and fever and the particular violence of the frontier in its rougher years, and he looked at the world the way a man looks at something he has personally constructed. The meeting happened in his study, the three of them, Harold and Aaron and Rosa, standing or sitting in an arrangement that felt like a court proceeding. Thomas Merriweather was not there. Rosa had asked him not to come because she did not want her father in the room when Harold Doyle decided whether or not to ruin him. She had wanted to be the one to stand between those two outcomes herself. Harold heard the whole of it without speaking, which was more frightening than if he had interrupted. He sat behind his desk with his thick hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving between his son and the young woman standing beside him, and his face was the face of a man absorbing a material blow and calculating the damage. When they finished, the silence in the room was extraordinary. "You are breaking an agreement," Harold said at last, looking at Rosa. "Yes," she said, "I am. And I understand the consequences of that, and I am prepared to address them." "The debt your father owes is not a small figure," Harold said. "I know. I am prepared to propose an arrangement for repayment. My father will need time and a reasonable schedule, but the debt will be honored in full." Harold looked at her, and she met his eyes, and she did not look away, and she could feel Aaron very still beside her. "And you," Harold said, turning to his younger son, "you think this is a suitable way to behave, to go behind your brother's back?" "I did not go behind Clifton's back," Aaron said, and his voice was even and quiet and completely without apology. "Clifton was told first directly. He is not in opposition to this. The arrangement was between you and Thomas Merriweather, father. Clifton and Rosa were placed in it the way you place a fence post in the ground. You did not ask either of them." Harold's jaw tightened. "I was looking after this family," he said. "I know you were," Aaron said. "You always are. I'm not disputing your intentions, but Rosa Merriweather is a person, not a term of a contract. And I love her." This last part came out with a simplicity and a directness that surprised even Rosa, who turned to look at him, and he was looking straight at his father with an expression that was open and honest and completely certain. Harold Doyle looked at his younger son for a very long time. "You love her," he repeated flatly. Yes. Since when? Since approximately the first morning she stood at the fence on the east side of the property looking like she was considering walking straight into the horizon, Aaron said. April 16th. It was a Tuesday. A stunned silence followed this. And then, from the doorway, Clifton's voice. I want the debt renegotiated to a fair repayment schedule, Father. Rosa's family has dealt with us honestly. What they owe should be paid back without penalty. Harold turned to look at his eldest son, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching the scene with the expression of a man who has already done his own accounting. You are defending this, Harold said. I am defending a situation that I was also a part of making, Clifton said, and I am telling you that I would rather have an honest reckoning than a marriage held together by obligation. He met his father's eyes. You raised us to be straight, Father. Let's be straight. The room held its breath. Harold Doyle sat behind his desk for a long, charged moment, looking at his two sons and the young woman standing between them, and Rosa watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the man who had built something real confronting the fact that real things sometimes require adjustment. A full repayment schedule, he said finally. Fair terms. Thomas Merriweather and I will work it out in writing. He paused. And you, he said, looking at Aaron, will build your own life. I'm not carrying two households. I know, Aaron said. I have savings enough for a start. I'm not asking you to carry anything. Harold looked at Rosa one more time. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of grudging respect that was perhaps as close to warmth as Harold Doyle came on short notice. You had better be worth the trouble, he said. I intend to be, Rosa said. She rode home to the Merriweather ranch that afternoon and sat down with her father and told him everything. Thomas Merriweather listened the way her mother had predicted he would, with his face going through alarm and then helplessness and then a slow, complicated relief. He wept a little, which he would have denied, and he held her hands across the kitchen table and he said, I should have asked you, Rosa, before any of it. I should have asked you first. You were frightened, Rosa said. I understand that. Fear is not an excuse, he said. Not when it's your daughter's life. No, she said. But you are my father, and I know you love me, and I think we can put it right. The months that followed were the most alive months Rosa Merriweather had ever experienced, which was both wonderful and exhausting, as the most alive periods generally are. Aaron had a parcel of land south of the main Doyle property, 40 acres of good grass with a creek running through the eastern edge, land he had been watching for 2 years and had put his savings toward the moment it came available. It was not much by the standards of the established ranches of the area, but it was real and it was his. And in late May of 1878 he walked Rosa across every foot of it on a bright afternoon, pointing out where the grass was thickest and where the creek ran clearest and where, on the slight rise at the center of the property, a house could sit and catch the evening light. It is not what you would have had, he said, and she could hear the care in his voice, the particular honesty of a man who wants to be sure the person beside him is choosing with full information. What would I have had? Rosa asked. The Doyle Ranch, an established house, a stable life. A life that was arranged without asking me, Rosa said. He looked at her. Aaron, she said, you have 40 acres with a creek and a rise that catches the evening light, and you are standing there with your hat in your hands asking me if I find it sufficient. And I need you to understand that this, she gestured at the land, at him, at the whole of the unremarkable and perfect afternoon, is the first thing in my life that I have chosen with my whole self. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was not quite steady, Then I'd like to ask you something. She looked at him. He was looking at her with those gray-green eyes and the particular expression she had come to love, the open, careful, completely honest face of a man who says exactly what he means. I would very much like to marry you, he said, if you are willing, not as an arrangement, as a choice, yours as much as mine, and only if it is freely made. Rosa Merriweather stood on 40 acres of Texas grass with the creek running silver at the edge and the evening light beginning to shift toward gold, and she thought about the morning she had stood at a fence and stared at the horizon and wondered if she could simply walk into it and disappear. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Freely and completely and without any reservations whatsoever. He smiled at her, that smile that happened in the eyes first, and he reached for her hand, and she gave it to him, and they stood there on the rise at the center of the land that was going to be theirs, and looked out at the wide, indifferent, glorious Texas sky. They were married in September of 1878 at the little white church in Carver Creek, on a morning when the heat had finally broken and the air had the first edge of autumn in it. The dress was not the cream silk from Abilene, which had been returned with apologies to the seamstress. Rosa wore instead a dress of pale blue cotton that her mother had helped her make, with small buttons down the back and a lace collar that had belonged to her grandmother. She thought it was much better. Pastor Willard performed the ceremony with his usual dry efficiency, and the church was full, because in a town the size of Carver Creek everything was everyone's business, and a story like this one had traveled with the thoroughness and speed of a grass fire. There were people who had come in simple goodwill, and people who had come to see what would happen, and Rosa, walking down the center aisle of the little church on her father's arm, looked neither left nor right but only ahead, at Aaron Doyle standing at the end of the aisle in a clean dark coat with his hat in his hands, and his gray-green eyes fixed on her with an expression of such focused and transparent happiness that she felt it like sunlight on skin. Her father pressed her hand and let her go, and she went forward to meet Aaron, and they faced each other before Pastor Willard and the assembled population of Carver Creek, with the uncomplicated certainty of two people who have already made their real decision and are here simply to say it out loud. When Pastor Willard reached the part about speaking now or holding one's peace, the church was quiet for a full held moment. And then Aaron turned to Rosa, privately within the public ceremony, and she could see in his face the same remembered morning, the fence and the horizon and the first honest answer she had given in 6 months. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. "I will," she said, when the time came, and she said it clearly and fully and without the slightest hesitation, and the word rang through the small church and out through the open door into the September air. Harold Doyle sat in the third pew with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in the expression Rosa had come to understand as his version of equanimity. And beside him, Margaret Doyle wept with the transparent sentimentality that had always been carefully concealed under her brisk efficiency and was now faced with a wedding, making its full appearance. Clifton sat with them, and he caught Rosa's eye as she and Aaron walked back down the aisle, and he gave her a nod that was small and real and utterly sincere, and she thought again what a fundamentally decent man he was, and how glad she was that he was not her husband. The ranch house on Aaron's 40 acres was not finished by the wedding, because 40 acres and a starting herd and a house all at once were rather more than one man's savings could manage without sequence. They spent the first months of their marriage in the small 2-room house that had come with the property when Aaron had purchased it, a rough timber structure with uneven floors, and a fireplace that smoked in a contrary wind, and a view from the single front window of the creek and the grass, and a horizon that seemed made specifically for looking at. Rosa loved it with a completeness that surprised her. She had grown up in the Merriweather ranch house, which was larger and more established, with proper curtains and a solid kitchen range, and a porch that had been repaired consistently over 20 years. The 2-room house on Aaron's 40 acres had none of these refinements. But it had been chosen. It was theirs. She scrubbed its uneven floors and hung her grandmother's curtains in the single window and learned the particular smoking habits of the fireplace in a contrary wind and thought, every morning when she woke to the sound of the creek and the light coming through the curtains, that she was happier than she had known how to be. Aaron was a good man to be married to, which she had suspected but was glad to confirm. He was attentive without being smothering. He was honest without being unkind. He had the same habit of asking the real question that he had exercised on that first morning, a habit that was sometimes uncomfortable and always valuable, and he applied it to their life together with a consistency that kept them from the kinds of small silences that grow into large ones over time. He was also, it emerged, a very capable rancher, which mattered considerably on 40 acres of Texas grass with a starting herd and no margin for error. He had an instinct for the land that went deeper than training, a capacity to read the grass and the weather and the behavior of animals that Rosa had seen in her father's best ranch hands, but had not expected to find in a man who had also read every book he could get his hands on since the age of 8. She said this to him one evening over supper, and he considered it, and said that he thought the two things were probably related, that reading carefully and watching carefully were not so different at their core. She thought about this for days. The first real difficulty came in the winter of 1878, which arrived with a severity that the old-timers said was the worst in a decade. Snow in the Texas Panhandle was not unheard of, but this winter brought it in earnest, a series of freezes that came down from the north with the relentless purpose of a creditor, freezing the creek and killing 3 of their small herd and making the 2-room house, with its smoking fireplace and uneven floors, a genuine test of will. Aaron was out in it for long days, breaking ice so the remaining cattle could drink, hauling feed through snow that came to his knees, working with a persistence that frightened Rosa when she watched him come home at the end of those days, gray with cold and fatigue, and eat whatever she had managed to make on the uncertain range and sleep for a few heavy hours before rising to go back out. She went with him when he would let her, which was not as often as she wanted, because he was protective in the way of a man who has walked straight into something hard and doesn't want the people he loves to walk into it too. They argued about this, one of their first real arguments in the cold kitchen on a January morning. "I am not made of glass," Rosa said. "I grew up on a cattle ranch. I know what a hard winter means." "I know you're not made of glass," he said. "I'm asking you to stay inside because the temperature is 15 degrees and there are ice sheets on the creek and I cannot watch you and watch the cattle at the same time. Then let me watch the cattle and you watch something else." "Rosa." "Aaron," she said in the same tone. He looked at her with the expression she had seen the first day, the one that found the precise shape of things, and he said, "You are going to make this very hard." "No," she said. "I am going to make it possible by helping. That is different from making it hard." He took a long breath, and she could see him letting go of the argument, not because he had lost it but because he could recognize the truth in it, and this was one of the things she loved most about him. They worked the winter together, side by side in the cold and the snow, and they lost only the 3 cattle they had already lost and came out of it in March with the herd intact, and the beginning of what would become one of those ranch partnerships, where 2 people are so entirely coordinated in their efforts that it is impossible to say later which idea or which decision belonged to which of them. Spring of 1879 brought the creek back and the grass and something else. Rosa told Aaron about the baby on an April morning, standing on the rise at the center of the property, where he had asked her to marry him almost exactly a year before. She had thought about how to say it and had decided that the way Aaron Doyle had taught her by example was the best way, which was simply and directly and without softening. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "In November, I think." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something so purely unguarded and full that she felt it in her throat. "Rosa," he said, and then nothing else for a moment because he seemed to have briefly exceeded the capacity of words. "I know it is early yet and I know the timing is complicated," she began, because there was the house to finish and the herd to build and the debt repayment schedule still running, and she had already been making calculations. "Stop calculating," he said, and took her face in his hands, which were warm despite the April morning, and looked at her with those gray-green eyes from a very close distance. Stop calculating for one moment. She stopped calculating. He kissed her carefully and completely, and then pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood on the rise with the creek running silver below them and the Texas sky enormous above them. And he said, very quietly, "I am so glad." "So am I," she said. The news traveled through Carver Creek with the efficiency of all news in a small town, and the response was warm and immediate. Margaret Doyle arrived at the ranch house the following week with a hamper of preserved goods and the specific expression of a woman who is trying to be gracious about something she had not initially been gracious about. And Rosa received her with the particular generosity of a woman who has already won and can therefore afford to be kind. "You will need more room in the house," Margaret said, looking around the two-room structure with professional assessment. "We are planning to build," Rosa said. "Harold will send men," Margaret said, in the tone she used for offers that were not quite offers but were not quite commands either. Rosa thought about this for a moment, about the complex architecture of Doyle family generosity, and said, "We would be grateful for the help." "Thank you, Margaret." Something softened in Margaret Doyle's face, briefly and completely, like a cloud moving off the sun. "You are good for him," she said, and Rosa understood she meant Aaron. He always needed someone who didn't need to be handled. Rosa thought this was perhaps the most insightful thing Margaret Doyle had ever said to her, and she was touched by it, and she said, "He is very good for me." The house went up over the summer, not fast but steadily. Aaron and the men from both ranches working on the structure that would sit on the rise and catch the evening light the way Aaron had described it on the first day he had walked her across the property. It was not a large house, but it was solid, with good timber walls and a proper kitchen, and a room for the baby that Aaron built with particular care, getting the floor absolutely level by the most painstaking method, checking it with a spirit level he had brought back from his surveying days, and resetting boards twice until it was perfect. Rosa found him doing this on a Sunday afternoon in August when she brought him water, and she leaned in the doorframe watching him crouch over the floor with his spirit level and his absolute focus, and she felt something so large and warm move through her that she had to hold onto the doorframe. "Aaron," she said. He looked up. She was not sure what was on her face, but it made him set down the spirit level and come to her, and she said, "I love you," in a voice that was not quite steady. He put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the door of the room he had built for their child on an August afternoon in 1879, and it was as simple and as enormous as anything that had ever happened. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I have loved you since you looked at that horizon like it had personally offended you." She laughed against his shoulder, that loud, unguarded laugh. "That is extremely specific," she said. "I am a specific person," he agreed. The baby came in November, as Rosa had predicted, with the first real cold of the season but before the severe weather, which was a mercy. Aaron's grip on her hand during the labor was such that Rosa later told her mother he had nearly broken 3 of her fingers, and her mother laughed and said that was exactly right, and she had done the same to Thomas Merriweather, and this information both comforted and delighted Rosa considerably. The baby was a boy. He arrived into the world in the new house on the rise at the center of their 40 acres, in the room with the perfectly level floor, in the early morning of November the 4th, 1879, and he was loud and pink and furious about the whole business in the way of a person who knows what he wants and is making his preferences clear. Aaron held him with the particular careful terror of a man holding something extraordinary, and his face was something Rosa would keep with her always, the open, undisguised, full completeness of it. "Hello," Aaron said to the baby, who continued to express his opinions loudly and without concern for the volume. "He has views," Rosa said, exhausted and entirely happy. "He is ours," Aaron said. "I expect he would." They named him Thomas James Doyle, for Rosa's father and for Aaron's grandfather, who Aaron remembered as the only member of the extended Doyle family who had ever openly agreed with anything Aaron said. Thomas Merriweather, upon being told this, sat in the Merriweather kitchen and wept without any effort to hide it, and Rosa held his hand and thought about how much had changed in the space of 2 years, and how it was possible to arrive at a place so much better than the one you had been heading toward. The debt to Harold Doyle was fully repaid by the winter of 1880, Thomas Merriweather having worked the repayment schedule with a steadiness that had eventually produced in Harold something that was, at minimum, a respectful acknowledgment of the man's character. The settling of the debt was attended to in Harold's study with a handshake and a brief, formal conversation, and when Thomas came home that afternoon Rosa could see from the way he carried himself across the yard that something had released in him, some long-held tension, and she went out to meet him and took his arm and walked with him. "It is done," he said. "Good," she said. He said, her father paused, that he had come to think the original arrangement might not have been his best idea. Rosa stopped walking. "Harold Doyle said that." "Not in those precise words," her father said. "More in the way of a man who has had a thought and is releasing it briefly into the air before taking it back, but yes. In essence, those were the words." Rosa thought about this for a moment, and then thought that this was perhaps as much as Harold Doyle was capable of, and that it was actually quite a lot, and she made a note to be kind to him at the next occasion she had. The occasion was Christmas dinner at the Doyle Ranch, which had become, over the course of 1879 and 1880, a somewhat different gathering than it had been in the years prior. There was Thomas James, who at 13 months was emphatically mobile and had strong opinions about the Christmas tree decorations, and there was Clifton, who had met a woman named Helen the previous spring, a schoolteacher from a family in Wichita Falls, practical and warm and possessed of a dry wit that had apparently delighted Clifton immediately and had not stopped delighting him since. And there was the whole strange accumulated warmth of a family that had come through a complicated passage and found itself on the other side of it in better shape than might have been expected. Harold Doyle held his grandson with the concentrated focus of a man who is recalibrating his understanding of what matters, and Thomas James regarded his grandfather with the frank interest of a 13-month-old. And at one point, Harold laughed, a real laugh, at something the baby did with a piece of ribbon, and Rosa caught Aaron's eye across the room, and they shared the particular look of two people who have been watching something long and slow and are glad to see it finally move. Clifton married Helen in the spring of 1881, a wedding that was everything the Doyle Merriweather wedding had not been, planned with Margaret's full organizational energy and the involvement of the entire population of Carver Creek and most of the surrounding area. Rosa stood in the church beside Aaron and watched Clifton's face when Helen appeared at the end of the aisle and thought again, as she had thought since the first afternoon in the parlor, what a fundamentally good man he was. The expression on his face when he saw her was entirely genuine. Aaron leaned down and said, quietly near her ear, "He looks the way I felt." "How did you feel?" she said. He found her hand in the space between them. "Like everything until that moment was preparation," he said. She held his hand through the whole of the ceremony. The years moved with the particular quality of good years, which is to say they moved fast and full, each season bringing its own demands and its own pleasures, the ranch growing slowly and steadily as Aaron applied the same careful thoroughness to land management that he applied to everything else. The south pasture was expanded in 1881, a second well dug in 1882, the kitchen of the house rebuilt and enlarged in the winter of that year. Rosa kept the books, which she had always had a facility for and which allowed her a clear-eyed view of their progress, and she began to teach the neighboring children 2 afternoons a week when the nearest schoolteacher left Carver Creek, a role that became so central to her life that by 1883 she had organized and largely funded the building of a proper schoolhouse on the edge of town. Aaron drove the last nail himself on a hot July afternoon, while Rosa stood below the half-finished frame and made suggestions that he pretended to find unnecessary and actually found invaluable. "Higher," she said. "I know where to put a nail, Rosa. I am sure you do. And yet—" He moved the nail slightly higher. The board sat perfectly flush. "Don't say it," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "You were absolutely going to say something. I was going to say that you are very talented with a hammer and that the schoolhouse is going to be beautiful." He looked down at her from the frame with the gray-green eyes that had not changed in 5 years and the lines around his mouth that came from smiling. "You were going to say I told you so," he said. "Simultaneously," she agreed. He came down the ladder and kissed her in the middle of the Carver Creek schoolhouse construction, which was witnessed by 3 ranch hands, the blacksmith's apprentice, and Pastor Willard, who had come to check on the progress, and who said dryly that he supposed the kissing could wait until the roof was on. In the late summer of 1883, Rosa told Aaron she was expecting their second child. She told him in the same place she had told him the first time, on the rise at the center of the property, because it seemed like the right place for news of this kind, and he responded with the same stillness and the same expression that exceeded the capacity of words, though this time the stillness was shorter because Thomas James, now 3 and extremely interested in everything, was tugging at his father's hand and demanding to know what was happening. "You are going to have a brother or sister," Aaron told him, crouching to the boy's level. Thomas James considered this with the serious philosophical attention of a 3-year-old. "Which one?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Aaron said. "I want a dog," Thomas James said. "That is noted," Aaron said gravely. The second child was a boy as well, arriving in February of 1884 into a February that was much kinder than the winter of 1878, mild and clear, with a sky that Rosa could see from the window of the bedroom in long blue strips between the moving clouds. She was better prepared this time, surer in her body, and Aaron was better prepared too, though he held her hand with no less intensity than the first time, which she was glad of. They named the second boy William, for no family obligation this time, but simply because Aaron had always liked the name, and Thomas James received his brother with a complicated mixture of fascination and suspicion that Rosa thought was probably the correct response to the arrival of a sibling. Thomas James got his dog that spring, a brown and white cattle dog with one blue eye and one brown eye that appeared at the ranch fence one morning without explanation and attached itself to the family with the completeness of an animal that has made a decision. They called him Creek, after the water that ran along the eastern edge of the property, and Creek followed Thomas James everywhere with the absolute devotion of a good cattle dog. And sometimes in the evenings Rosa would look out the window and see her eldest son crossing the yard with the dog at his heels, and feel something so vast and quiet in her chest that it required a moment of simply standing still to receive it. Clifton and Helen had a daughter in 1882 and a son in 1884, and the two families moved in the easy orbit of people who are genuinely fond of one another without complication, the children growing up together on the connected properties, with the casual confidence of children who have always known where they belong. Harold Doyle mellowed in ways that were gradual and never fully acknowledged, the kind of mellowing that happens when the facts of one's life consistently contradict one's more rigid positions. And by the mid-1880s, he had arrived at something that genuinely resembled warmth where Rosa and Aaron were concerned, a warmth expressed in the gruff, indirect Doyle manner, but unmistakable in its presence. He came to the schoolhouse opening in October of 1883 and sat in the front row and said nothing during the ceremony, but afterward he found Rosa and said, without preamble and without quite looking at her, "My wife says this school is going to be the best thing that's happened to this county in 10 years. She is usually right about these things." "Please tell her thank you," Rosa said. "Tell her yourself," Harold said. "She'd prefer to hear it from you." And he walked away, which was Harold Doyle's version of a benediction. The schoolhouse opened with 19 students in October of 1883 and had 31 by the spring of 1884. Rosa had hired a proper teacher, a young woman named Grace Farrow, who had come from Ohio, and who brought with her a collection of books that filled 2 shelves and a determination to educate the children of Carver Creek that matched Rosa's own. They became friends in the way of 2 women who recognize in each other a similar quality of purpose, the kind of friendship that is practical and warm and entirely honest. Aaron came to the school one afternoon in April when the windows were open and the smell of the spring grass came in on the breeze, and stood in the doorway watching Grace teach an arithmetic lesson to a row of focused children. And when they walked home together through the last of the afternoon, he said, "You built something real." "We built a real ranch," she pointed out. "That is different," he said. "The ranch is ours. The school is for everyone." She thought about this. "When I was standing at that fence on the first morning," she said, "I was thinking about how small my life felt, how arranged, and I was thinking that I wanted something to be mine, chosen and mine. And now?" he asked. She looked at the land around them, the 40 acres that had become 60 with the addition of the south pasture, the house on the rise with the window that caught the evening light, the creek running at the eastern edge, the schoolhouse just visible in the direction of town. "Now I think I want things to be ours," she said. "And the school is for everyone, which is the best version of ours I can think of." He put his arm around her as they walked, and the sun was going down over the flat Texas plain in the extravagant colors, it reserved for evenings when it wanted to make a point, and she leaned against him, and they walked home through the last light together. Thomas James was 6 in the fall of 1885 and started at the Carver Creek schoolhouse with all the confidence of a boy who has grown up hearing his mother plan and build the place, which Grace Farrow channeled productively and quickly. He was a clever boy with his father's habit of asking the real question and his mother's loudness when something delighted him, and these combined in him in a way that made him frequently interesting and occasionally exhausting and entirely himself. William, at a year and a half, was darker and quieter than his brother, more given to observation than action, watching the world from wherever he had placed himself with an expression of profound assessment that Aaron said was exactly what he himself had looked like at that age, and that his mother had always found alarming in its seriousness. "He is thinking very hard about something," Rosa said one morning, watching William sit in the middle of the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a bowl, rearranging them in different configurations with the focused repetition of a small scientist. "He is always thinking very hard about something," Aaron said. "He is going to be an engineer or a philosopher or possibly both." "He is 1.5, Rosa said. "Look at him," Aaron said. Rosa looked at William, who had placed the bowl upside down and was balancing the spoon vertically on its base with his full concentration. "Possibly both," she agreed. The Christmas of 1885 was the first year all 4 of the Doyle grandchildren were old enough to be collectively present and collectively mischievous at Christmas dinner. And the dinner was a glorious and chaotic affair that left the Doyle house looking as though a small and happy tornado had passed through it. Harold Doyle sat at the head of the table with 2 grandchildren on his lap at once, and a third demanding to tell him something urgent, and his face had in it none of the careful reserve with which he had sat in his study in April of 1878, and told Rosa she had better be worth the trouble. He looked like a man who has been surprised by contentment. After dinner, when the children were distributed among various laps and adults in the sitting room and the evening had settled into the warm, slow comfort of good food and company, Aaron came to sit beside Rosa on the settee, and she leaned into his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she thought about a list she had never written but had always carried, of the things she had wanted when she had not known how to say them out loud. To choose, to be asked, to belong to something she had built herself. The year 1886 brought a 3rd pregnancy, which Rosa noticed in March with a mixture of joy and the practical calculation she had learned to perform efficiently by now. She told Aaron on the rise again, because the rise was their place for important news, and this time Thomas James and William were both present because she had not managed to engineer a private moment. And Aaron's response was complicated by the fact that Thomas James immediately and loudly demanded to know if this one was going to be a dog, which made Aaron laugh so hard that the moment was somewhat different from the previous two, but entirely perfect in its own way. "Is it a dog?" William asked in his serious voice. "No," Aaron said, crouching between his sons with tears of laughter still at the corners of his eyes. "It is a baby, your brother or sister." "Creek is better," Thomas James said honestly. "Creek is an excellent dog," Rosa agreed. "And a baby is also going to be excellent, in different ways." The baby arrived in October of 1886, a girl, with a shock of dark hair that Rosa's mother said was exactly what Rosa had looked like as a newborn, and eyes that were going to be brown, you could already tell, the particular warm brown that Thomas Merriweather had once called the color of good river mud. They named her Clara, for Rosa's mother, who received the news sitting in the Merriweather kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and who wept immediately and without reservation, and then went directly to the stove to put the kettle on because this was the kind of news that required both tears and tea, and she was not going to sacrifice one for the other. Thomas Merriweather, upon being told his granddaughter bore his wife's name, went outside and walked around the barn twice and came back with red eyes and said gruffly that it was a fine name and he was glad of it. And Rosa hugged him in the yard in the October light and thought about how much love could accumulate in a family over years, how it layered and deepened and changed shape without ever becoming less. Clara Doyle was a peaceful baby, which was a mercy given that she arrived into a household containing two energetic brothers, a cattle dog, and two parents who were managing 40 acres of Texas ranch, a schoolhouse, a book of accounts, and the ordinary beautiful chaos of a life fully chosen. She slept in the room with the perfectly level floor, the room Aaron had built before Thomas James was born, and the spring sunshine in the mornings came through the curtains and fell across her face, and Rosa would sit beside the crib in those mornings and feel the particular fullness of a life that has more in it than you could have imagined when you were standing at a fence staring at the horizon. By 1887, the Doyle Ranch south of Carver Creek had grown to 75 acres, with a small but healthy herd and a steady reputation for good cattle that had begun to bring buyers from as far as Abilene. Aaron had added a foreman, a steady man named Abel Wright who had worked cattle since before the war, and who brought with him a fund of practical knowledge that even Aaron's surveying experience did not fully cover. And the two of them ran the ranch with a complementary thoroughness that Rosa watched with admiration and documented carefully in the ledger books. The schoolhouse had grown too, a second room added in 1886 to accommodate the children of 3 new families who had settled in the area, and Grace Farrow had recruited a second teacher, which freed Grace to teach the older children more advanced subjects. Rosa sat on the school's small committee of patrons with the minister and the blacksmith and Harold Doyle, who had joined without being asked, and who had turned out to have very strong opinions about arithmetic, which Rosa considered highly appropriate given the source. It was at a school committee meeting in February of 1887 that Harold Doyle said something that Rosa kept for a long time. They were discussing the acquisition of more books for the advanced students, and Harold had just agreed, somewhat grudgingly, to contribute to the cost, and he was preparing to leave when he paused in the doorway and turned back to Rosa with the expression she had come to know, the one where he was about to say something that cost him something. "I was wrong," he said, "about the arrangement. You and Thomas and Clifton and all of it. I was treating people like ledger entries, and I was wrong." Rosa looked at him. Harold Doyle, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse in February with his hat in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes, paying a debt that had nothing to do with money. "Thank you for saying so," she said. He nodded once crisply and put his hat back on. "The books," he said. "Get the good ones, don't go cheap on the editions." "I wasn't going to," Rosa said. "Good," he said and left. She sat in the empty schoolhouse for a moment after he went, listening to the February wind moving around the building, and thought about the strange and winding mercy of things, how nothing had gone the way it was supposed to go and how everything had turned out better for it. Spring of 1888 found the Doyle family in a state of the particular contentment that is only possible when you have been through something hard together and emerged from it intact and know it. Thomas James was 8 and ferocious at arithmetic, and had recently discovered that horses could be spoken to at length and listened patiently, which had made him an excellent small hand in the paddock. William was 4 and had indeed turned out to be a person of profound and systematic curiosity, who had at various points in the past year taken apart a clock, a door latch, an Abel Wright's boot with scientific thoroughness, and managed to put all of them back together, the boot somewhat imperfectly. Clara was 18 months old and had recently learned to walk, which she did with the determined focus of a person who has identified an objective and is going to reach it regardless of the structural difficulties involved. And Creek, the cattle dog, followed her with the worried attention of a herding dog confronted with a very small and irrational charge. On an April morning in 1888, exactly 10 years after the first morning, Rosa stood at the fence on the east side of the Doyle South Ranch property and looked at the horizon. She heard boot steps on the gravel. She turned. Aaron came across the yard with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in slow circles, and he came to stand beside her at the fence, and they both looked out at the flat Texas land with the creek running at the eastern edge and the sky enormous above it. "You don't look like you're fixing to bolt," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't." The spring morning was mild and clear, and from somewhere in the direction of the house came the sound of Thomas James telling someone, at volume, about something that required immediate attention, and the lower murmur of William's thoughtful response, and the sound of Clara's small feet on the porch, and Creek barking at a butterfly with the earnest irrelevance of a good cattle dog who has run out of cattle to manage. Aaron put his arm around Rosa's shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence and looked at the horizon that had seemed to her, 10 years ago, like something to escape into, and that seemed to her now like something that simply marked the edge of the world she was standing in, which was wide enough and full enough and entirely, completely, freely chosen. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the horizon and then up at the sky, at the particular shade of blue that had always made her ache, wide and infinite and gorgeous. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am glad you asked." He turned to look at her, those gray-green eyes. "Which time?" he asked. She thought about April 16th, a Tuesday, a fence post, a woman staring at the horizon, and a question so simple and so right that it had changed the entire shape of everything. "Both times," she said. "All the times. Every time you ever ask me anything." He smiled at her, the smile that went to the eyes first, and she smiled back. And somewhere behind them Thomas James was still telling someone about something urgent, and Creek was still barking at his butterfly, and Clara was still crossing the porch with her deliberate, determined walk, and the 40 acres, which were now 75, stretched out around them in the April morning, chosen and real and theirs. Rosa Merriweather, who was now Rosa Doyle, who had once stood at a different fence on a different April morning, and wondered if she could walk into the horizon and disappear, stood in the light with her husband's arm around her and felt the ground solid under her feet, and thought that she would not change a single step of the road that had brought her here, not the fear or the difficulty or even the arranged beginning, because all of it had led to this. A man who asked, and a woman who finally answered. And the Texas sky went on above them, wide and blue and completely indifferent to the smallness of human arrangements, the same sky that had looked down on the frontier in all its roughness and beauty, on the hard years and the good ones, on the people who had built something out of dust and will, and the occasional courage to say the true thing out loud. On the rise at the center of the property, in the house with the perfectly level floor and the window that caught the evening light, 3 children were beginning a Tuesday in April with the total absorption of children who have no knowledge yet of the roads not taken, of the other mornings, of the question that changed everything. They would learn it eventually. Rosa would tell them the story on evenings when the children asked where they came from, and she would tell it the way her husband had taught her to tell things, simply and directly, and with full attention to the real question underneath the surface one. She would tell Thomas James and William and Clara about a fence and a horizon and a woman who had not been asked until she was, and about a young man with gray-green eyes who had turned his hat in his hands and said, with a simplicity that contained everything, "Are you happy about this?" And she would tell them that the answer she gave that morning had been the truest word she had ever spoken, and that from that true word everything else had grown, the ranch and the house and the schoolhouse, and the 3 of them, whole and loud and entirely themselves, making their particular and irreplaceable noise in the morning light of a world that was wide enough, finally, to hold all of it. Thomas James would nod seriously at this, already knowing the weight of honest questions, already practicing them on horses and dogs and his father. William would take it apart and put it back together in his mind the way he took apart everything, finding the internal mechanism, understanding how one true thing leads to the next. And Clara, when she was old enough to hear the full story, would look at her mother with the brown eyes that were the color of good river mud, and she would ask, with the directness of a Doyle child, "And were you happy?" And Rosa would look at her daughter in the room with the perfectly level floor, and then out the window at the rise and the creek and the flat Texas land going on to the horizon, and she would say, with all the certainty in the world, "I am now." And it would be the most completely true thing she had ever said, in a life that had learned, one question at a time, how to tell the truth.